I am Kaya Oakes, and this is an excerpt from the introduction of my book, Not So Sorry. The Lord's Prayer, so central to Christian worship around the world, also emphasizes that forgiveness is more about God changing a person's desire to fight back and using that choice to not retaliate to change the society around us. In the series of petitions that make up the prayer in Matthew's version, the most commonly used one, the penitent asks God for forgiveness, not other people. Forgive us our debts. Forgive us our sins. Forgive us our trespasses. This is repeated for emphasis. In the Lord's Prayer, it is only once God has granted us forgiveness that we can grant the same thing to others. But Jesus was not thinking of sending someone a Hallmark card to say sorry. In his Jewish understanding, we had to atone first, and forgiveness could mean sending someone away, putting distance between ourselves and someone who's harmed us, or even deciding never to see that person again. The simplistic definition of forgiveness as an end of resentment doesn't work for Jesus, and it should not necessarily work for us either.
I am so happy to now welcome to Read, Pray, Write, Kaya Oakes, a journalist, author, professor at UC Berkeley, and culture critic about all things faith. I count myself very lucky to have been inspired by her work to pursue my own writing about faith and spirituality, and I've even been so lucky as to be her student. And so she's coming to our new Read, Pray, Write studio from California, which means you had to wake up much earlier than the rest of us. So thank you, Kaya, for that, and welcome. Not So Sorry, Abusers, False Apologies, and the Limits of Forgiveness is that your fifth book or your sixth book?
It's a sixth.
Six, wow. And as always, I love how you back your culture critiques with such great research and case studies from current events and the expert sources that you use. And especially the very kind of topical turn on Bible study, which was the reading we did. And so my first question connects to the Bible interpretation that you give. And just how have mainline Christian and Catholic faith communities kind of gotten it wrong when it comes to interpreting Christ's teachings about forgiveness?
Well, it's for various, we don't have to get into all the complex historical stuff, but for a lot of reasons, I think it has to do with anti-Semitism and the fact that we historically have kind of downplayed Jesus's Judaism, and as a result of that, lost the more nuanced messages about forgiveness that are present throughout if you read the Bible as a whole. There's a lot of different versions. There are many forgivenesses, and so yeah, I think there's a lot of neglecting to think about the way that the original language is interpreted now. And I spoke to scholars of the Hebrew Bible and thought really about what words Jesus would have used for forgiveness, and none of them meant something like forgive and forget. They were different meanings.
I also liked, maybe it was in interviews that you mentioned that so many Catholic saints, since you and I are both the Catholic tradition, were beatified precisely because they forgave and we're told to follow their example. What is kind of left out on those saint stories and some of that teaching, do you think?
Well, obviously the interior, the interior monologue, unless they kept a diary but unfortunately a lot of female saints couldn't read and write, so they were not able to write down what they were thinking and feeling until fairly recently, with some notable exceptions. So as a result, we don't know what their interior process was like to get to forgiveness. So we only get the picture of whatever's been harm done to them, and them forgiving that, often in very extreme situations, which were probably exaggerated in order to make them seem very holy and pure, which they were holy people, but purity is in the eye of the beholder. So, so forgiveness their decision to come to forgiveness is something that we'll never really understand fully in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm. Based on your research and all that you've investigated for the book, is it ever okay to not forgive as an individual and maybe even as an institution? Because you do spend a lot of time talking about the institutional implications of forgiveness and power dynamics.
Is it okay not to forgive? So in a contemporary perspective from people like psychologists and sociologists, yes, it's okay not to forgive. Now, the reason that they say that is because they understand that trauma and things like historical wrongs are not that easily let go of. And so, from a psychological point of view, the idea of you don't have to necessarily hold a grudge forever if you don't forgive someone. You can choose not to forgive, but also make that a moral choice. In other words, this is possible for me, this is wrong for me, this is going to cause more harm for me and other people, especially when it's an abusive person who will use that forgiveness to keep abusing. But from a faith perspective, unfortunately, we're often told that you have to forgive everyone, everything. And so I think that can be very damaging in some cases. And I do wish that we had more nuanced understandings of that question of whether it's okay not to forgive. But unfortunately, in most cases, and this is an interfaith thing, it's not just Christians, but Jewish people have a different understanding of forgiveness, and so do Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. But all of them put forgiveness as a very high good. So, how do we make it okay for people to choose not to do that if it's going to enable further harm, right?
Right. And I think you also addressed, I found this very interesting, that if you are the person who has done serious harm to another and you actually seek forgiveness with a sincere apology, but you feel like you should be forgiven quickly, or I should forgive myself. What are the consequences of that forgiveness being handed to you too quickly?
Well, it doesn't give the person who did the harm time to actually change, right? So
Right.
we have this kind of mythology in America of self-reinvention and that it can happen very quickly. It's the Hollywood ending of a person can turn their whole life around in a montage that is 5 minutes long, that they go from XYZ to being at the gym and like going to therapy and going to AA. And then 5 minutes later, they're a completely different person. And that's not how it actually works. And so, again, it just leads to this kind of oversimplified understanding that can cause problems.
That makes sense. And so, yes, I think it's interesting for the person who's doing harm, that actually can harm them even,
Right. Yeah.
not just the victim.
And yeah, it can be a form of permission, like to keep
Mm-hmm.
it. And when you think about things like domestic violence, that's the kind of unfortunate scenario we see a lot and oftentimes women forgiving men and the men continuing to be abusive. And it's when the person decides that they will no longer be forgiving that the abuse can finally stop.
And I think you also use an anecdote. You talk a bit about adult children of alcoholics, and there can be a reaction to, if you have an actively abusing parent, for instance, who doesn't reform or doesn't make attempt at recovery, that can carry that to the next generation, which is, well, they're not stopping, then it must be okay for me to do it, that kind of thing. So there can be ripple effect of the people seeking forgiveness not making restitution, or some change. So there's so much more in this book about the social justice aspects of forgiveness, and so I'm going to encourage all my listeners to get this book, especially if there's someone who ever struggled to forgive, or you forgave quickly and you forgot about it, or regretted it. I guess if you forgave quickly and regretted it, or if you feel burdened for not being forgiven. And that's where I'm kind of presenting your text as something you can use the 4 steps of spiritual reading to kind of take that time for yourself to process that. So I like to say that spiritual reading gives me the pace, space, and grace I need to go deeper in my life, where deeper can mean all sorts of things, ranging from that self-knowledge, self-acceptance to deeper faith belief. So particularly in light of what you've learned about forgiveness through the book, how do you, Kaya, find or recognize or stay open to grace in your life, the grace that you need to go deeper?
Well, I think that it's really important to maintain relationships with other people who are asking the same questions that you are about whatever you define as God, whatever you define as faith, whatever you define as religion, because these are very politicized terms in our culture. They're very loaded terms, especially right now. And so just having years ago, I was on a retreat, and the retreat leader used the term soul companions. So like who walks with you? And it doesn't necessarily, when I say active relationships, sometimes those are, found in reading that we do, right? Sometimes
Yes.
they're found in nature, sometimes they're found in relationships with people who've gone before us, but oftentimes it's more conversational, interactional, and yeah, so somebody who has a very similar lens on how they see the world can help us to remain open to the presence of divinity in whatever form that takes for us.
So finding grace in community in
Exactly.
some way. Right. Right.
Yeah,
That's
I
great.
think that becomes even more important when you are troubled by decisions that your church or your religious institution has made, or you disagree with the teachings on 1 or 2 or 75 levels, that you find other people who figure out ways to keep living into their faith relationship, maybe outside of the structure of the
Right.
institution.
Right. Yeah, that encouragement, that support you need,
Yeah.
that's not just what the mainline faiths are saying. That makes sense. So that's great. And I just want to really thank you for the time. And so thank you.
Thanks, Jane.